All right, good morning, everyone. It is Thursday, February 20th, a little after 9:30. We are taking a look at draft language on the miscellaneous cannabis bill today. We have counsel here, Michelle Childs. So this is language that would suggest the suggestions, some of it through the industry, some of it through CCB. Something that Representative Boyden and I have been working on a little bit. And so this kind of like what we were doing with the elections bill yesterday and into today is just a rough starting off point for the conversation. Some of us were down yesterday with stakeholder engagement roundtable with license holders and operators within the cannabis profession. So we heard some thoughts on how policy could evolve or adjust from them. So right now, we just wanted to run through the opening draft with council and just get an idea of like what our starting point is. Yeah. Good morning.
Good morning. For the record, Michelle Childs, Office of Legislative Counsel, and I believe everyone has a copy of the draft. It was just signed out for introduction, so it should be out probably on Tuesday, maybe tomorrow.
They went to drafting yesterday. We sent it over.
Yep, I approved it, and so it's in the queue, but drafting office is understandably a little overwhelmed right now. So, but you'll be seeing it in the next couple of legislative days. There's a few new people that I haven't met around the table. So like, I know a lot of you who've been here. Do you mind? And,
you are.
Oh, well, sorry. Representative Matt Byron, Addison 3, chair of the committee. How are you? Good to see you.
Never met you before.
Representative Lisa Hango, Franklin 5, nice to see you again.
Representative Lucy Boyden, 103, Cambridge, Waterville.
Sandy Pincinel, Bennington, Lawrence 1, Dorset, D&D, Mount Tabor, Peru, and Mayville.
Michael Morgan, Grand Isle, Chittenden, West Milton, South Hero, Grand Isle, North Hero, Islamont, Albert.
Neil Coffin, Windsor 2, Avonish, Weathersfield, Baltimore.
Catherine Stone, Burlington.
Hi, Jane Waters Evans, Charlotte Heinsberg.
So, and for the new folks, so I am part of the judiciary team for council. So I am not typically in government operations, but I am on this one issue related to cannabis because I've been in the office since the 90s and cannabis was illegal across the board at that time. I work on all issues related to regulated drugs, illegal drugs. I also do family law, domestic and sexual violence legislation, abortion, and a number of other issues. But the reason why I'm here on this, and is usually the only reason I'm in here, is on the cannabis issue. And so for a little background for the new folks, Vermont has been regulating cannabis and has had a medical cannabis registry for a significant amount of time. In 2020, the legislature adopted a commercial regulation and tax system. And then so the program is still relatively new. It took a little bit of time to stand up the program. You have the Cannabis Control Board. You have their very excellent chair here today who can talk to you probably about some of the reasons behind the legislation that's being proposed. Because it's really still kind of in its infancy around standing up the program. We kind of have like every year there's an annual kind of miscellaneous bill because we're learning new stuff every year and little tweaks and how to adjust to the market, to licensees, to what's going on in the community. And so usually you'll see me in here every year with a miscellaneous cannabis bill. So I'm going to just give you kind of a high level walkthrough of this. Like I said, The majority of the proposals are in here are things that were requested by the Cannabis Control Board. And so I think probably James can, if he, have specific reasons about why is this change needed, things like that. James is probably the best one to address that. So I'm going to start with section 1. And remember that Cannabis Control Board regulates commercial cannabis sales to adults 21 years of age and older, but also they run the medical registry program, and they regulate dispensaries that serve medical patients. So in section 1, there is a small tweak to section 832. You'll see there on we're on page 2 on lines 11 and 12. You'll see that right now in current law, cannabis that's possessed unlawfully in violation of statute can be seized by law enforcement and subject to forfeiture. And we're just adding the words there, or administrative rules adopted pursuant to the title, because as you know very well, rules still have the same force of law. And you want to make sure that if the General Assembly through statute is directing the board to be adopting rules to carry out legislative intent, you want to make sure people are adhering to that. And that if people are possessing cannabis that's in violation of those rules, that that cannabis can be seized if it's in violation of administrative rule. Section 2 is the authority for criminal background checks. So under current law, if folks are going to apply for a cannabis establishment license, there has to be a criminal background check done on someone. So that would provide the CCB with information about whether or not this particular person has any type of criminal record, and that's considered your application about whether or not to issue them a license. So you'll see at the top of page 3 in subsection B, directive that fingerprint-based state and national criminal history record checks. So that's not just checking the state database, but also checking with the FBI to get a national look. It's directed that it has to be fingerprint-based. Sometimes record checks are done just by name and date of birth only, but these would be fingerprint-supported checks. And it's requiring it for each natural person prior to being issued a cannabis establishment identification card. So anybody who is an applicant or someone who is working as an employee of a licensee has to have a CCB ID card. And so this is putting in there and clarifying that you have to do the fingerprint-based entire check for someone who's going to be issued a card. Section 3. For those of you who were here last year, you might recall that in the miscellaneous bill, you adopted a new definition of hemp products, and you did that in Title 6, which is your agriculture title. And for some reason, it just slipped our minds and we didn't think to change that definition in Title 7 in the cannabis laws. And so we are just taking that same definition. And this was the issue, if you recall, related to like cannabis products, hemp products that have a higher level of THC that's derived from hemp, and the authority of the board to be able to be regulating, because you had prior to that, to last year, had given the board the ability to regulate those products. So thinking of things that oftentimes come from out of state and they're marketed as something that has psychoactive results, and they're not actually derived from cannabis, they're derived from hemp, but they have the higher THC levels.
Representative Hango.
Just to clarify, this is really like a technical correction.
Yes.
In that statute. It doesn't change.
Doesn't change
that we
anything.
decided
You already
on last
adopted the
year.
same exact definition last year. We just needed to put it in 2 places, and I only put it in
Perfect.
1.
Because this is a weird one where it bridges, it touches on agriculture and Title 7, which is where the CTV and like all, basically like, that's all like the DLL stuff. Blah, blah, blah. So we're just parking it in 2 different.
Yep.
All right, cool. Look at me learning.
So on page 4, section 4, starting on line 12. So this is the section on rulemaking for cannabis establishments. So when I'm talking about the commercial side, I'll use the term cannabis establishment. If I'm talking about the medical side, I'll use the term dispensary or an integrated licensee, which can do both. So section 881 is long. And I just want to note here that if you look at the introductory language in subsection A, So each subdivision sets forth the rules for each type of licensee. However, subdivision 1, which I don't think I made any changes to, but I do like to put it when we're amending that section so people can see that there are a number of directives to the board around rules that they have to adopt that apply to all cannabis establishments. So that's what you have in subdivision A1, and that continues on page 5, page 6, page 7. You can see all of those. Then at the bottom of page 7, there's a new requirement that the board adopt rules relating to requirements and criteria governing licensee applications to change ownership, control, or location of the business. The next one is you'll see at the bottom of page 7, subdivision 9 on line 21 is you'll see in a moment, a little later on the bill, is that there is a new license that's being established, which is a trim and harvest license. And so you need some rules around that that are applicable just to those types of licensees. So if you look at page 8 at the top of the page, you'll see the things that the board is required to adopt rules on regarding this new licensee. So it's requirements for verification of the license's clients. They're going to be serving other licensees. And I think James can probably talk to you a little bit more about what the trim and harvest people do, but it's not like necessarily a particular location of the business, but they are traveling to cultivators and processors and providing services to other licensees. So subdivision 9B is essential content and permissible terms of written service contracts. Subdivision 9C, provisions to ensure safe and lawful transportation and lodging of traveling personnel. So it could be people who are going to different cannabis farms and providing services. So again, they're not in a static place. Next one on subdivision D is essential content of employee health, safety, and skills training, including first aid and recognition of common pests and pathogens. E is requirements appropriate to minimize the risk of pest and pathogen transmission from farm to farm. And the last one is procedures for documenting lawful compensation.
So my question about that is this establishing a new license or just the ability for rulemaking?
So in a later section, we're establishing the new licensee. So generally the way that, when we create the bills, we do them numerically according to section number and how they appear in the title. And so I will get to that shortly. So section 5 has to do with criminal background checks for applicants. And you'll see on lines 18 and 19 on page 8 is the ability for the board to do rechecks for applicants. So it's not, so that would mean that you don't just, currently they only have the authority to do that record check when the person is applying. This would allow them, let's say you've had somebody who's had a license for a few years, this would allow them to recheck that person's criminal history record.
And based on what criteria, why would someone be subject to that?
So the language here is for good cause or with prudent frequency. These are good cause is something that is like a legal term that's frequently used. So the board would have to articulate a particular reason as to why they are checking.
What was the second one about frequency?
With prudent
What
frequency.
is that?
I would say that would be a good question for the board or for general counsel.
Okay. One seems kind of ambiguous. Thanks.
So page 9, so subsection C. Again, for those of you who have been on the committee, you've heard the board, I think, come before you probably in each miscellaneous bills for at least the last 2 years. We've been kind of tweaking the language around the background checks that we get from the feds. And the issue has been about whether or not the feds will release those national background checks to the CCB. Again, I think I'll let James kind of update you where they're at with that. But because of difficulty in not just Vermont, but other states being able to obtain those national record checks from the FBI, states have sometimes had to go to third-party operators that do kind of compiling of records to obtain those record checks. And so you'll see the language that's on lines 5 through 7 is that if required records are not reasonably available to the board due to circumstances beyond its control, with the consent of the applicant, the board can accept third-party criminal background check information from a reputable commercial provider. Bottom of the page on line 19 is just a clarification that consumer credit scores are not to be a basis for denial of a license. Page 10, section 6, and this is on cannabis establishment identification cards. The substantive language is at the top of page 11. And this is authorizing the board for good cause to issue temporary permit authorizing someone to serve as an employee of a cannabis establishment. And you'll see on lines 8 and 9, they specifically articulate that, and this is not exclusive, but that something that you could show for good cause is that if the application is reasonably expected to take more than 12 days to process. And so this is in the case of if it takes a long time being able to get the record check information, that the board would be able to issue a temporary license. So let's say if you've had a licensee and they've lost 3 employees, they've got 6 employees and they've lost 3 employees in the last month, they've hired some new folks. If there's a backup and a delay in processing the records, then they could allow people to at least be hired and get started while they're continuing the process for the background checks. So section 7, I'm just going to touch on. So this is having to do when a cannabis establishment becomes distressed through like the death of the owner of the cannabis establishment, through bankruptcy, something like that. And the Cannabis Control Board has been working, I think, with DFR, with tax, and also with the attorney on our staff at Legislative Counsel, Cameron Wood, who handles corporations for us, on a process for receivership of a cannabis establishment that is in distress. I know they're also having conversations with the court about this. And so I'm not going to go too much into the language because this is probably going to be shifting. But generally what it is to do is like what happens. So, if you think about it, this is again, a new industry in Vermont. We had a kind of a big rush there at the beginning with a lot of people looking to get licenses to have a cannabis establishment, and not all of them are going to succeed. And so what happens when that business fails for whatever reason? They've got a lot of cannabis. What do you do with that cannabis? How do you dispose of the assets? How do you deal with that? And so this is one of the issues that I think, one of the sticky issues that the board has been dealing with. And I think as you move through committee testimony, I think you'll be seeing probably some new language on this that's going to be coming from the board. Page 14 on section 8. This is where in the law where they discuss the different types of licenses and the general provisions. On page 15, you'll see in subsection D, instead of 7 licenses, there's going to be 8. And there's the new, on line 14, the new trim and harvest license. On page 16, there's some language on lines 5 and 6. So under current law, someone can only possess one of each type of license. So you can't have someone who has like 5 retail shops or multiple farms. You can only have one of each. However, there's some clarification language there on lines 5 and 6 to clarify that if you're talking about a trim and harvest service licensee, this provision around one location doesn't apply to them providing services at multiple locations. Page 17 on section 9, this is amending the section on cultivator licenses. You'll see down at the bottom of the page, D1D. Right now, their cultivators are required to have a produced on date on the finished cannabis product. And that's being changed to a harvested date that reflects the date that the cultivator harvested the cannabis, and then a packed on date that reflects the date that the product was packaged for sale. Section 10 is propagation cultivator licenses. So these are essentially kind of like nurseries. I think y'all added the propagator license either last year or the year before. And you'll see on subdivision A2 on line 16 and 17, this is just allowing a propagator to be able to sell like immature plants, clones, things like that to retailers. Right now, they're just authorized to be selling them to other cultivators, but they could sell them directly to retailers because you do have in Vermont the ability to grow your own cannabis at home. You can have a couple of mature plants and some immature plants, and this would allow a nursery essentially to sell to a retailer that could sell to the public those little starter plants. Page 19, section 11, this is your new establishment of your new trim and harvest service license. So you'll see that these types of licensees are permitted to contract with cultivators who are already licensed with the CCB on a seasonal or temporary basis to supply specific cannabis maintenance services within the scope of each client's cultivator license. Section 12 is your fee schedule for the different types of licenses. You'll see on lines 15 and 16, subdivision 8. The new trim and harvest annual licensing fee will be $500. Then there's a couple changes to existing fees. You'll see on subdivision 9 on line 17 and 18 is that cannabis establishments that are licensed by the board are assessed currently an annual licensing fee of $50 per employee. And this proposal changes that to be biennial. So instead of every year, it's going to be every 2 years. Subdivision 10, starting on line 19, there's also a fee for product registration. That is currently also on an annual basis of $50 for every type of cannabis and cannabis product that's sold. And that also is proposed to be changing from an annual to a biennial assessment. Page 20 at the top of the page. There's permission on lines 1 through 3 for the board to be able to issue longer product registrations for products that it deems to be low risk and shelf stable. So instead of, again, currently it's annual, generally it would move to every 2 years, but then they could issue longer ones in certain circumstances.
Just 1 second, Council Representative Hooper.
So this may answer my question from way back where you had a pick date, process date. Are we inferring that there's kind of like a best buy or an expiration date on some of these products?
I would assume so, but I think that would be a better question for the board, for me, about those. But I think there are some that are, that are like it's just like shelf stable that don't necessarily have an expiration. And they can probably talk to you about which products fall into which areas.
Some of this came up at the roundtable yesterday about. Roundtable yesterday, some of this came up. Yep.
So staying on page 20, you'll see that there's some language that is struck in subdivision, what would be 12B there. This is a moot issue. This was done kind of as a stopgap measure, kind of when things were rolling out in terms of how the licenses came online, and there were certain application periods. So that basically the board didn't get overwhelmed with having to issue all the types of licenses all at once. It's a kind of a moot issue now, so that doesn't need to be there. This was kind of just allowing somebody to kind of hold their place in line to be able to get a license if they had already applied, if they had an intent to apply. Sections 13, I think it's just 13. This was asked for by the tax department. And I'm gonna let them explain to you why.
Okay.
Honestly.
I hear that.
But this was something that I think they contacted the board about and said, hey, on your miscellaneous cannabis, can you just include this? And I think perhaps this was something that was kind of more of an oversight, in past years about taxes. So if you look, the next change is on page 22. Section 14 at the top, which you probably look at it and like, impossible to tell what that heck that means. And I'm sorry for that, but that's the way we have to draft it. And essentially what it's doing is, so when everything was set up in 2020, the idea is so you have a cannabis regulation fund. Essentially the monies that would go into that fund as originally conceived would be the license fees, application fees, all of those kinds of things. And that fund was for running the regulatory system, and that board would use that to execute all of things that you're asking for them to do. Then there's tax monies, right? So there's a excise tax, and then there's a sales tax. Sales tax goes to education funding. Excise tax was originally designated to go to the general fund. It quickly became apparent that with all the requirements that were and obligations that were given to the board, that the license fees and all those things were not going to be able to fund the regulatory system because and the chair can, I'm sure, talk to you about this, but the issue was that you didn't want the fees to be so high that it discouraged people who were currently operating in the illegal market from moving into the regulated market. And so there was a lot of discussion about what is a fee that will encourage people to shift into the regulatory market. And everyone quickly found out that the fund didn't have enough money to run the program. And so there was language that was enacted that put a temporary shift for the tax money, the excise tax money, to go into the Cannabis Regulation Fund to fund the operations and all that it has to do. And then whatever surplus would then go to the general fund. That is due to expire this July 1st. So what this very convoluted language does is it amends the act that was reverting back to the original language where the tax money would go to the general fund and not to the Cannabis Regulation Fund. Does that make sense?
I understood it.
I don't. So could you please repeat that?
So original legislation, so you have the Cannabis Regulation Fund. That's what runs the board and everything that they do. Was originally conceptualized to contain mostly just fees, license fees and things like that would go in there. The excise tax money was to go to the general fund, and then the General Assembly would decide what they're going to do with it. The fees alone were found to quickly not be able to sustain the work of the board. And so the legislature said, we're going to temporarily send the excise tax to the regulatory fund to make sure that the CCB has enough money to do what we're asking it to do. But we're hoping after a while, the fees and everything like that will be so much that we won't need to do that anymore. And we can send the excise tax back to the general fund. That has not borne out. And so this is essentially repealing the provision that you put in there, which was the temporary kind of repeal. So July 1st of this year, if you don't do section 14, that money is going to go back to the general fund and you're going to short the regulatory fund.
And that blows a massive hole in your operation budget.
Right.
So, Representative Waters.
Thanks. Is this making it permanent then, that money is going to be going to the?
Yes, I mean, you can make policy decision that you want to kick it out 2 years or do something
Sure.
like that or whatever. But this is just repealing that stopgap.
So this is like, I mean, like totally different policy, totally different conversation, but it's like kind of the same sort of just like language move that we're doing with the sunset on the sunset, but there are no cocktails, right? We're removing the sunset that we sunsetted.
Yes.
So it's like functionally the same thing, just a completely different bucket of vice. Yes.
And I'm sure you guys see it all the time where you have like a prospective repeal and then you kick that repeal out and then you kick that repeal out and that kind of stuff. So it's the same thing.
And so the conversation we're gonna have is like, do we just repeal it? Or do we revisit this over X period of time? So that's a.
And I'm sure you'll hear, I don't know if, I mean, I know it's gonna go to the money committees, but you know, JFO can talk to you about like what those numbers look like because you know, whatever's left over in the annual budget that the Cannabis Control Board doesn't expend does go to the general fund. So
Correct.
they can look at those numbers and tell you kind of basically, and you can see basically what is, you know, what is the tax money funding that wouldn't otherwise be funded by the licenses and fees.
Did that answer your question, Morgan?
I think so, because my question was, if I'm hearing it correctly, is we would obviously be talking to appropriations to say, hey, you're not gonna get this money in part, as part of the general.
So basically, like, yes, so my question is there, like, are they anticipating this?
That's what I mean.
Or is this unknown to them?
Right.
Because even if we didn't do this, we would have to find money somewhere for the operations of the Cannabis Control Board's duties as charged by the legislature, right? So the whole intent of this was for them to essentially be self-funded. Whether it be originally it was through the license structure and the blah, 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 but then shortfall, boom, need to capture from the excise. Anything above and beyond operational costs still kicks to the general.
But we would
Right?
still
Say
have
those
that,
words correctly?
yeah, it makes sense. But we would have that conversation with them.
Oh, for sure,
Yeah,
for
yeah.
sure. Yeah, there are fiscal impacts all over the place with this bill. Yes.
All right. So section 15 is related to 14. So it's the same thing. So 14 and 15 are the same issue around repealing the prospective repeal. So section 16, session law, is that it's doing a temporary moratorium on the issuance of new retailer licenses until July 1st of 2027. However, there are some exceptions, which are in subdivisions 1 through 4. So you see the first one is that annual renewals of retailer licenses that were originally issued prior to February 1st of this year can be issued. So if you have a retailer license now, you can renew your license. It's not going to change that. Subdivision 2 is amendments and early renewals of retailer licenses that were originally issued prior to February 1st. But like maybe they're changing the location of their shop. So that's not meant to be necessarily like a new retailer license that would kick them out of this ability to get that license. On page 23, subdivision 3, amendments to and early renewals of retailer licenses that were originally issued prior to February 1st can be issued in the case of changes of control of the licensed retailer. So if you have certain people who have applied, shop's going to still keep running. It's been sold to someone else. They've gone through the process. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden they can't, you know, like, so it's just trying to keep the operation going. You've changed ownership. And then subdivision 4 is the board can issue new retailer licenses prior to that July 1st, 2027 date. If the number of licensed retailers is fewer than 80 locations. And my understanding from the members who are on the bill is that that's kind of trying to track the number of liquor establishments in the state.
Yes. And so this is going to be, there are a lot of very strong opinions on both sides of this conversation right now. And as far as there's nothing, I mean, there's always points of contention in these bills with sentiments throughout the industry and the public, but I think that is one that's going to make, is going to raise a lot of concern within the industry and the public. So just flagging that situational awareness for the committee, that provision right there is gonna drive some chatter. So,
Get some ire.
we'll call it chatter. Does anyone have a question for council? We do have a joint assembly in 19 minutes, so I do want to give Chair Pepper an opportunity to just run through some of this. Or
I just wanted to mention on section 17, there is the creation of a new position for enforcement attorney. There's not an appropriation on that because my understanding from the chair is that it's in the budget already. And so,
Okay,
but just wanted to note that there is the creation of a new position.
thank you very much. Yeah, I was kind of jumping. Thank you, council. And don't forget the effective date. Chair
Did you have a
Pepper,
question?
how are you?
No, I was just gonna.
Yeah. Let me in my focus. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. For the record, James Pepper, Chair of the Cannabis Control Board. My laptop's out of juice, so I got my phone here. Oh, thank you. I should just once again thank you all for attending or watching the roundtable yesterday. There's a lot of anxiety in this industry. It's a challenging industry. It's one like no other because of the federal status. You guys have, this committee in particular has taken the lead every year on making sure that the rules and regulations stay in advance of the industry, keep pace with this ever evolving landscape. A lot of what's in here with respect to what the board asks are really kind of technical fixes that were brought to us by our compliance team and our licensing teams. And just trying to stay ahead of issues that we see. Other than kind of the retail moratorium, I don't think there's a lot of kind of new policy in here, but that's just my perspective. Happy to go through it section by section or come back at a later date.
I think I just want to open up for a little like Q&A for you for perspective on this because we do move the joint assembly
Right.
in 15 minutes and I'd like to break 5 minutes before for folks. So Representative Hooper and Burlington.
Let's start at the end and go back to the beginning. What's the health of the industry? A lot of the places that I stop into are teetering on not profitable, or I assume that's what the moratorium on licensing is somewhat directed by. And
Yes, I mean, there's kind of an unnatural, non-normal distribution of retail locations in the state, largely driven by the opt-in, opt-out. I mean, the kind of case in point is Burlington, I think, has 14 retail locations, whereas South Burlington and Williston both have 0. And it's not that there aren't cannabis consumers in South Burlington and Williston, it's just those towns have not opted in. So Burlington is, supplying the demand for those towns. And I think if the opt-in, opt-out presumption was flipped, you'd see kind of a more normal distribution, geographic distribution of retail locations. So, and that's true of Rutland, that's true of Morrisville. Morrisville, has 4 or 5 and Stowe has 0. And so, they're supplying the demand, not just for kind of Stowe and the regional area, but also the kind of tourist that area. I think that largely the retailers are kind of doing the best profit-wise. I think there's the people that are struggling the most are certainly the smaller outdoor cultivators. There's some kind of structural challenges that they face, not just kind of with extreme weather events, pesticide, issues growing outdoors. But also when you're competing for limited retail shelf space, and what retailers want is just consistency. They want a product that they can rely on their shelves, that their customers can kind of grow accustomed to. And outdoor cultivators get 1 harvest a year. And so they're not able to provide the retailers with that kind of consistency. And yet they have all the kind of regulatory burden and cost as any, cultivator would have. So, there's some very strong signs in this market. There's some very, positives, but there's also some people that are struggling.
dispensaries.
I think that if the dispensaries were able to spread out more, they wouldn't be struggling quite as much. I think that, not every small town is going to be able to, support a dispensary. I think, what you did last year was you gave us some authority over retail siting. Those rules have been they've been drafted. They're in kind of comment period right now, which will hopefully have the effect. I should say we are in a retail moratorium right now, a self-imposed one by the board, while these rules are being drafted. And I think that moratorium might kind of extend beyond, if I were to just look at my crystal ball, be it beyond the kind of promulgation of those rules, because no matter what we do on retail siting, it's going to put a cap on the number of retail licenses that we can issue. And I think when we get to a cap, then we have to think about how we're going to kind of competitively score an application. If there's only one spot left in the town, we get 2 applications for it. How do we decide which application is going to be the successful one?
So that was gonna be my last question. Are we moving towards basically, limiting?
I think our rules will give us a limit. I think what, the moratorium language was requested by the Cannabis Retailers Association. They would like to see just a pause on all, they would like to see the status quo be the permanent status, at least for the next 2 years. I think that, where the direction the board would like to see is, let's get these retail setting rules. Let's think about, right now it's just based upon municipal populations. Why don't we look at kind of regional populations and things like that, but allow those rules to go into effect and try and get a more normal distribution.
Thank you.
All right, I got one more hand up from Representative Coffin, then we're calling it.
This goes back to that last section as well, where we're talking about the 80
Yeah,
licenses.
Right.
If it dropped below that, you would
Yes.
issue one.
right.
Is 80 locations is that what we have right now, or is that what is the board is considering as the minimum for the health of the industry?
So 80 is the request from the Retailer Association because that's roughly the number of liquor licenses, liquor stores, 802 spirit stores that there are in the state. Of course, 802 Spirits, the state is the wholesaler for alcohol, so they have a little bit more control over where those locations are. And also, there's also distilleries and bars. There's other ways to access alcohol than through an 802 Spirit store. So I think cannabis and alcohol are not kind of perfect, comparisons when you think about the regulatory framework.
That was the basis.
Yeah.
All right, I was just wondering where the number.
Yeah,
came from.
I
If that
think
was
it's-
needed to maintain industry health, or was it?
No, that's just kind of, it's based upon 802 Spirits, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
I can give you some backstory on that stuff later. Okay. Chair Pepper, thank you so much for the
Yes,
time.
thank
This
you.
is definitely just the opening salvo, a long and in-depth conversation we will have with this bill and its provisions. Autumn, with that, take